Carl Jung spent decades documenting its manifestation in his clinical practice. What he discovered would fundamentally challenge our understanding of power dynamics in human relationships and reveal a truth: that those who feed on others' emotional energy would prefer remained hidden in the shadows of collective unconsciousness. Jung witnessed something remarkable. Empaths, those deeply sensitive souls who absorb the emotional turbulence of everyone around them, possess within themselves a latent power that, once awakened, renders them completely immune to the very manipulation tactics that once controlled them. This transformation doesn't occur through aggression or retaliation. Instead, it emerges through something far more revolutionary: the conscious integration of their own completeness. The journey from unconscious emotional absorption to sovereign self-possession represents what Jung termed an alchemical process. In medieval alchemy, practitioners sought to transform base metals into gold through a series of purification stages. Jung recognized this as a metaphor for psychological transformation, where the raw material of unconscious suffering becomes transmuted into the refined gold of conscious wisdom. For the empath, this alchemical process involves years of absorbing others' emotional poison, carrying burdens that were never theirs to bear, and serving as unconscious containers for the disowned shadow material of everyone around them. Then, at a critical threshold that Jung called the breaking point, something miraculous occurs. The accumulated weight of absorbed darkness doesn't crush the empath's spirit. Instead, it catalyzes a transformation so complete that the person who emerges barely resembles the one who entered that crucible of suffering. What makes this transformation genuinely dangerous to those who profit from empathic dysfunction is not that empaths become hardened or cruel. The danger lies in something far more threatening to manipulative systems. Empaths become unbreakable. They develop what Jung called psychological immunity, a state of consciousness where manipulation attempts are perceived with crystalline clarity, but no longer have the power to penetrate their carefully constructed boundaries. The gentle soul who once absorbed every criticism, who apologized for others' bad behavior, who twisted themselves into impossible shapes trying to earn love from those incapable of giving it, suddenly stops participating in the entire theatrical production. Without their unconscious cooperation, the whole manipulative apparatus collapses like a house of cards in a strong wind. Jung understood that empaths are not born as victims, though they are certainly targeted as such. Instead, they possess neurological wiring that makes them exquisitely attuned to the emotional states of others. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Jung intuited through careful observation. Empathic individuals display hyperactive mirror neuron systems and heightened activity in brain regions associated with emotional processing and social cognition. This neurological architecture allows empaths to feel what others feel with remarkable accuracy, to sense emotional undercurrents beneath surface presentations, and to intuit needs that remain unspoken. For much of human history, this capacity served tribal survival, as empathic individuals could detect threats through subtle changes in group dynamics and emotional atmospheres. However, in contemporary society, where authentic emotional intelligence is often pathologized as oversensitivity, this same neurological gift becomes a vulnerability that predatory personalities exploit with surgical precision. The narcissist, sociopath, and emotional vampire possess an almost supernatural ability to identify empaths in any crowd. They recognize the telltale signs: the person who apologizes first after conflict, who takes responsibility for others' emotional states, who believes that love requires endless self-sacrifice, who has been conditioned to believe their own needs are less important than maintaining relational harmony. These individuals become prime targets not despite their emotional sensitivity, but precisely because of it. The manipulator requires someone who will absorb their disowned feelings, carry their rejected shame, and serve as a convenient repository for all the shadow material they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. The empath, conditioned by childhood experiences and cultural messaging to equate their worth with their usefulness to others, unconsciously volunteers for this role, believing that their capacity to endure emotional pain without complaint represents a virtue rather than a wound. Jung observed this dynamic repeatedly in his clinical work and recognized it as a collective pattern that transcended individual pathology. He saw empaths who had given away their power so completely that they no longer recognized themselves in the mirror. They had become what he termed provisional personalities, constructed entirely from others' expectations and demands rather than emerging from authentic self-knowledge. These individuals presented with a peculiar kind of suffering that couldn't be relieved through symptomatic treatment alone. No amount of anxiety medication could resolve the fundamental problem. They had lost connection with their own psychological center. They existed in a state of perpetual self-betrayal, sensing that something essential had been sacrificed, but unable to articulate what or how to reclaim it. The transformation Jung documented begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with a subtle shift in perception. The empath starts noticing patterns they had previously rationalized away. They observe that certain relationships consistently leave them feeling depleted rather than nourished. They recognize that they habitually accept blame for situations they didn't create. They realize they've been apologizing for their own existence, shrinking themselves to accommodate others' egos, and performing elaborate emotional labor that receives neither recognition nor reciprocation. This growing awareness creates what Jung called cognitive dissonance, an uncomfortable tension between their lived reality and the stories they've been telling themselves to make that reality bearable. This dissonance becomes increasingly impossible to ignore. What happens next separates those who transform from those who remain trapped in cycles of unconscious suffering. Some empaths, confronted with the painful truth of their situation, retreat back into familiar patterns of self-deception. They convince themselves that one more conversation will finally make the narcissist understand that they simply haven't loved hard enough or sacrificed deeply enough to earn the authentic connection they crave. These individuals remain caught in what Jung called the provisional life, always preparing to truly live, but never actually doing so. However, other empaths reach a threshold where continued unconsciousness becomes more painful than the terror of awakening. These individuals make a choice, often unconsciously at first, to face the full truth of their situation, regardless of how much that truth might hurt. This choice initiates what Jung termed the night journey, a descent into the personal unconscious where all the repressed truths have been waiting. The empath must confront the rage they've been taught to suppress, the boundaries they've been conditioned to believe are selfish, and the self-protection instincts they've been trained to override in service of others' comfort. This confrontation with the shadow, with all the disowned aspects of self that don't fit the good person narrative, represents the most challenging phase of transformation. It requires admitting uncomfortable truths. The empath must acknowledge that they've been complicit in their own victimization, not because they deserved abuse, but because unconscious patterns drove them to seek out what was familiar rather than what was healthy. They must face how their identity has been constructed around being needed, how their sense of worth depends on others' validation, and how terrifying true autonomy actually feels when you've spent your entire life defining yourself through relationships. Jung recognized that this shadow integration represents the crucial turning point in psychological development. Most therapeutic approaches of his era focused on strengthening the ego to better resist unconscious impulses. Jung took a radically different approach, arguing that health comes not from repression but from conscious integration. The qualities that had been relegated to shadow, the anger and selfishness and capacity for coldness, are not inherently negative. They represent unlived life, aspects of the personality that were sacrificed to maintain attachment to caregivers or to survive in environments where full self-expression was dangerous. The awakening empath must reclaim these shadow qualities, not to become them exclusively, but to have access to their full range of human responses. Anger stops being terrifying and becomes information about boundary violations. Selfishness stops being shameful and becomes healthy self-care. The capacity to cut people off stops being cruel and becomes necessary discernment about who deserves access to your inner world. This integration process creates what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold opposing forces in creative tension until something new emerges. The empath who successfully integrates their shadow doesn't lose their capacity for compassion. Instead, their compassion matures from naive absorption to conscious discernment. They can feel deep empathy for someone's pain while simultaneously recognizing that person's manipulation tactics. They can love someone and still choose not to have them in their life. They can offer support without taking responsibility for outcomes. This represents a level of psychological sophistication that those operating from unconscious patterns simply cannot comprehend or manipulate. The transformed empath develops what Jung termed active imagination on steroids. Their already heightened ability to read emotional undercurrents becomes razor sharp when directed consciously rather than absorbed unconsciously. They begin noticing micro-expressions that reveal the gap between someone's words and true feelings. They sense the manipulation in what others present as concern. They feel the hook in offers that masquerade as generosity. This heightened perception, combined with newly integrated boundaries, creates an individual who is functionally immune to the standard manipulation playbook. The narcissist who once controlled them through guilt discovers that guilt no longer lands. The emotional vampire who fed on their need for approval finds that approval no longer matters. The gaslighter who convinced them to doubt their own perceptions encounters someone who trusts their instincts implicitly. This transformation doesn't happen overnight or through a single insight. Jung emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who others need you to be, represents the work of a lifetime. However, there are definitive stages that mark progress along this path. The first stage involves recognition, where unconscious patterns become visible. The empath begins documenting their experiences, noticing the recurring themes in their relationships, and identifying the specific tactics that have been used to control them. This documentation serves a crucial function because manipulators thrive on making you doubt your memory of events. When you have a written record, you can't be convinced that your perception of patterns is distorted or that you're overreacting to isolated incidents. The second stage involves reclamation, where the empath begins taking back the energy they've been giving away unconsciously. This means stopping mid-explanation when they realize they're defending their basic humanity to someone who has no intention of understanding. It means ending conversations that go in circles, recognizing these as manipulation tactics designed to exhaust rather than resolve. It means no longer responding to provocations intended to make them react emotionally, so their valid concerns can be dismissed as emotional overreaction. Every time the empath withdraws energy from these dysfunctional patterns, they reclaim a piece of themselves that had been trapped in serving others' dysfunction. The third stage brings integration, where the empath consciously develops the qualities they had previously feared or rejected. If they've been afraid of anger, they practice feeling and expressing it appropriately. If they've believed that boundaries make them cold or selfish, they implement boundaries and observe that the sky doesn't fall. If they've feared being alone more than being mistreated, they choose solitude and discover it's actually peaceful rather than punishing. Each of these experiments with previously forbidden aspects of self proves that the catastrophic outcomes they'd been conditioned to expect don't actually materialize. The people who threaten to abandon them if they ever set boundaries were never genuinely connected to begin with. The relationships that required their constant self-betrayal to maintain weren't relationships worth having. The fourth stage manifests as embodiment, where these new patterns become integrated into the empath's automatic responses rather than requiring conscious effort. They no longer have to remind themselves to maintain boundaries, because the boundaries are now part of their psychological architecture. They don't need to talk themselves into choosing self-care, because self-care has become non-negotiable. They've moved from knowing intellectually what they should do to actually doing it without internal conflict. This embodiment represents what Jung called the synthesis of conscious and unconscious, where hard-won conscious insights become integrated into the personality structure itself. The final stage, which Jung termed individuation, involves becoming fully yourself while remaining meaningfully connected to others. This might seem paradoxical, but Jung understood that genuine connection only becomes possible between two individuated people. When your sense of self depends on another person's validation or presence, you don't actually have relationship. You have enmeshment, codependency, or unconscious need fulfillment masquerading as love. The individuated empath can engage in profound intimacy precisely because they're not trying to complete themselves through another person. They come to relationships whole and seeking to share that wholeness rather than arriving empty and hoping to be filled. This transformation terrifies those who have benefited from empathic dysfunction because it fundamentally disrupts the power dynamic they've spent considerable energy establishing and maintaining. The narcissist's entire identity structure depends on having access to empathic supply, someone who will reflect back the grandiose self-image they're attempting to project. When the empath withdraws this function, the narcissist experiences what Jung called ego death, though they lack the psychological capacity to use this as an opportunity for growth. Instead, they typically escalate their manipulation attempts or quickly seek new sources of supply. The empath who once would have felt responsible for the narcissist's distress now recognizes this response as confirmation that they made the right decision. The escalation doesn't make them doubt themselves. It validates their perception that this person cannot relate to them as an autonomous individual deserving of respect. Jung documented several specific dynamics that occur when an awakened empath encounters someone attempting to manipulate them. First, there's what he termed the projection boomerang. The manipulator attempts to project their own qualities onto the empath, accusing them of being selfish when they set boundaries, calling them cold when they stop providing endless emotional labor, or labeling them as the crazy one when they stop accepting gaslighting. The unconscious empath absorbs these projections, internalizing them and working desperately to prove they're not the terrible person being described. The The awakened empath recognizes projection immediately and refuses to accept delivery of accusations that don't belong to them. They understand that when someone describes you in terms that don't match your actual behavior, they're likely describing themselves and the qualities they can't consciously acknowledge. Second, Jung observed what he called the charm offensive escalation. When standard manipulation tactics stop working, the predatory personality often shifts to intense displays of affection, promises of change, or performances of vulnerability designed to bypass the empath's newly established boundaries. The unconscious empath, relieved that the difficult person is finally showing the love they've been craving, drops their guard and gets pulled back into the dysfunction. The awakened empath recognizes this pattern, understanding that genuine change happens gradually through consistent behavior over time, not through dramatic declarations that conveniently appear whenever boundaries threaten the manipulator's access. They watch behavior rather than listening to words, and behavior doesn't lie the way language can. Third, Jung identified the social pressure campaign. Manipulators, especially those in family systems or social groups, will often recruit others to pressure the awakened empath back into their former role. Flying monkeys, as they're colloquially known, appear with messages about forgiveness, family obligations, or how the empath is being too harsh or unforgiving. The unconscious empath, lacking confidence in their own perception and deeply conditioned to value social harmony, caves to this pressure. The awakened empath recognizes that people who weren't present for the abuse have no standing to judge their response to it. They understand that those delivering these messages are often either manipulated themselves or benefiting from the empath remaining in their unconscious role. The awakened empath's immunity to these tactics creates what Jung termed a consciousness crisis in their relational systems. Families organized around one member's narcissism must reorganize when the scapegoat or lost child refuses to play their assigned role anymore. Workplaces where one person takes credit while others absorb blame must restructure when the blame absorber stops accepting responsibility for failures they didn't cause. Friend groups where one person's drama dominates every gathering must evolve when the emotional support provider establishes boundaries around their time and energy. This reorganization process is rarely smooth. Systems resist change, and the people benefiting from dysfunctional dynamics will fight to maintain them. This is where the awakened empath's newly integrated shadow becomes essential. The capacity to tolerate others' discomfort without rushing to fix it represents a revolutionary act for someone conditioned to be everyone's emotional regulator. The awakened empath watches family members have feelings about their boundaries and doesn't intervene to make those feelings more comfortable. They observe colleagues struggling with tasks the empath used to handle for them and doesn't step in to rescue them from the natural consequences of their own incompetence. They witness friends complaining about the loss of their constant availability and doesn't apologize for having a life beyond serving others' needs. This capacity to let others experience the results of their own choices without jumping in to absorb or manage their emotional responses creates space for genuine growth or reveals who was never actually interested in authentic relationship. Jung understood that this refusal to participate in dysfunction serves as a kind of mirror, reflecting back to others what they've been unconsciously demanding. Many people, when confronted with this reflection, become uncomfortable and defensive. Some will do the difficult work of examining their own patterns and attempting to build more conscious ways of relating. These individuals, even if the specific relationship with the awakened empath cannot be salvaged, will benefit from the mirror being held up. Others will refuse to look at what's being reflected, instead attacking the mirror itself. they'll blame the awakened empath for being changed, difficult, or no longer the person they knew. Jung recognized this response as confirmation that the relationship was based on the empath's unconscious dysfunction rather than their authentic self. These people never knew the real you because you were never permitted to be real around them. The process of awakening, while ultimately liberating, involves tremendous grief that Jung believed must be honored rather than rushed through. The empath grieves the relationships that cannot survive their transformation. They grieve the years spent trying to earn love that was never actually available. They grieve the person they might have become if they hadn't spent so much energy managing others' emotions. They grieve the fundamental unfairness that they have to do this difficult psychological work, while those who harmed them likely never will. This grief is legitimate and necessary. Jung emphasized that we cannot integrate what we haven't first acknowledged and mourned. Attempting to bypass the grief stage, to jump directly from recognition to empowerment, creates what he called a false integration that will eventually collapse under pressure. However, Jung also observed that empaths who fully honor their grief while refusing to become stuck in it eventually emerge with a quality he termed amor fati, the love of one's fate. They reach a place where they wouldn't change their history because their sensitivity, even with all the pain it caused, also gave them gifts that those operating from unconscious patterns cannot access. Their capacity for deep feeling, their ability to perceive emotional truth, their drive toward authentic connection, these qualities that made them vulnerable to manipulation also make them capable of experiences and relationships that shallow people will never know. The awakened empath learns to hold both truths simultaneously. They wish they hadn't suffered, and they're grateful for who their suffering forged them into becoming. This integration of paradox represents advanced psychological functioning that Jung termed the union of opposites. The awakened empath becomes comfortable with contradiction in ways that the binary thinking of unconscious patterns cannot accommodate. They can love someone and still choose not to be in relationship with them. They can feel compassion for someone's woundedness while refusing to tolerate their harmful behavior. They can be deeply sensitive while maintaining firm boundaries. They can be open-hearted while remaining discerning about who receives access to that heart. This capacity to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to resist the pressure to simplify complex realities into either-or thinking, represents mature consciousness that serves as both protection and gift. The sovereign empath that emerges from this process possesses qualities that Jung associated with psychological wholeness. They're comfortable with the full spectrum of their humanity, neither inflating their positive qualities nor excessively focusing on their flaws. They can acknowledge mistakes without descending into shame spirals. They can recognize their gifts without needing external validation to confirm their worth. They can receive genuine love without the hypervigilance that comes from waiting for the other shoe to drop. They can offer authentic care without depleting themselves or losing their center. They can engage conflict directly rather than avoiding it or being destroyed by it. They can sit with ambiguity rather than demanding premature clarity. They can change their mind when presented with new information rather than rigidly defending positions that no longer serve them. These capacities emerge not from reading about psychology, but from doing the actual work of shadow integration that Jung detailed in his writings. This work requires what he termed the courage to be disturbed, the willingness to have your comfortable illusions shattered if those illusions prevent you from living authentically. For empaths, this means confronting how they've used their empathy as a defense mechanism, believing that if they could just understand someone deeply enough, they could make that person incapable of hurting them. It means acknowledging how they've been addicted to potential, staying in situations that harm them because of who someone might become, rather than who they actually are. It means recognizing how they've sometimes used their sensitivity as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for their choices, framing themselves as passive victims of their own emotional nature rather than active participants in their lives. These realizations sting precisely because they require releasing the comforting narrative of pure victimhood. Jung understood that we cannot reclaim our power while simultaneously maintaining that we have none. The awakened empath must acknowledge that even in situations where they were genuinely victimized, they have power now in how they respond to that history. This doesn't mean the abuse was their fault. It means their healing is their responsibility, and no one is coming to rescue them from the work of becoming whole. This represents a sobering but ultimately empowering truth. If your healing depends on someone else, particularly on the person who harmed you, acknowledging that harm and making amends, you've given away your power to the least reliable person possible. The awakened empath stops waiting for external validation of their experience and begins validating it themselves. This self-validation practice represents revolutionary action in a culture that trains people, especially empathic people, to look outside themselves for confirmation of reality. The awakened empath begins trusting their own perceptions, even when others insist those perceptions are distorted. They honor their own emotional responses, even when others label those responses as overreactions. They maintain their boundaries even when others call them selfish. They choose themselves even when others call them cold. This unwavering commitment to their own truth, even in the face of social pressure to abandon it, creates an internal stability that Jung termed the individuated center. This center cannot be shaken by external forces because it's rooted in self-knowledge rather than others' opinions. The development of this center involves what Jung called withdrawing projections, taking back the qualities you've been unconsciously attributing to others and recognizing them in yourself. The empath who's been projecting their own strength onto others, seeing them as more capable altogether than themselves, must reclaim that strength and acknowledge their own capacity. The empath who's been projecting their own wisdom onto gurus or experts must recognize their own inner knowing as equally valid. The empath who's been projecting their own completeness onto romantic partners must accept that they don't need another person to make them whole. This withdrawal of projections can feel destabilizing initially because it removes the scaffolding of external reference points. However, it ultimately liberates the empath from requiring others to be what they need them to be, which is the root of most relational suffering. Jung observed that the awakened empath often goes through a phase of what appears to be selfishness as they overcorrect from years of excessive selflessness. They might become rigid with boundaries, suspicious of others' motives, or unwilling to offer help even in situations where they genuinely could without harming themselves. This represents a necessary stage that he termed the swing to the opposite, where the psyche must experience the extreme of previously avoided behavior before finding balance. The empath who's never said no might go through a period of saying no to everything. The empath who's always explained themselves might stop offering any explanation. The empath who's been endlessly available might become entirely unavailable. Jung counseled patience with this phase, recognizing it as the psyche's way of testing the waters of new behavior in a protected environment, before developing the nuance to respond situationally. Eventually, with continued consciousness, the awakened empath develops what Jung termed the transcendent function in its mature form. They can access both poles of any binary without being trapped in either extreme. They can be generous or boundaried as the situation warrants. They can be open or protected depending on the trustworthiness of the other person. They can be soft or firm based on what the moment requires. This flexibility emerges not from people-pleasing adaptability, but from genuine wholeness that encompasses the full range of human response. The sovereign empath responds authentically to each unique situation rather than reacting from unconscious conditioning, and this represents mastery of the psychological arts that few people ever achieve. This mastery makes the awakened empath genuinely dangerous to systems built on unconscious exploitation because they model an alternative way of being that others find compelling. When people encounter someone who's simultaneously compassionate and boundaried, open and discerning, loving and self-protective, it awakens questions about their own relational patterns. Why do I accept treatment from my partner that this person wouldn't tolerate for a moment? Why do I feel guilty setting boundaries when they seem completely comfortable doing so? Why do I twist myself into knots trying to manage others' emotions when they seem able to care without caretaking? These questions, once awakened, become difficult to suppress. The awakened empath's presence serves as an invitation to consciousness that some will accept and others will violently reject because the implications are too threatening to their entire life structure. Jung believed that every individuated person contributes to the evolution of human consciousness itself, creating what he termed permission waves that make it easier for others to follow. The awakened empath who establishes boundaries in a family system makes it easier for the next person to do the same. The awakened empath who leaves an abusive relationship provides a template for others considering similar action. The awakened empath who prioritizes their well-being over social approval gives others permission to question whether social approval is worth the cost of self-betrayal. This ripple effect extends far beyond the individual, potentially impacting generations. The child who witnesses a parent finally establish boundaries learns that self-respect is possible. The colleague who observes someone refusing to absorb unearned blame learns that protecting yourself doesn't make you a bad person. The friend who sees someone choose solitude over toxic companionship learns that being alone is preferable to being mistreated. However, Jung also warned about what he called the inflation that can occur when someone first awakens to their psychological power. The newly awakened empath might become judgmental toward those still caught in unconscious patterns, forgetting that they too were once unconscious. They might develop spiritual or psychological superiority, believing they've achieved a level of development that makes them fundamentally different from others. They might use their newfound understanding of manipulation to manipulate others, justifying this as appropriate boundary setting when it's actually revenge disguised as self-protection. Jung emphasized that genuine individuation includes humility, the recognition that consciousness is an ongoing process rather than a destination, and that everyone is fighting battles we know nothing about. The highest expression of empathic awakening, according to Jung, involves becoming what he termed the wounded healer who has been healed. This archetype represents someone who has descended into their own darkness, integrated their shadow, and emerged with wisdom forged through suffering. Unlike the wounded healer who's still bleeding, still unconsciously needing clients or loved ones to need them so they can avoid their own healing, the healed wounded healer offers help from overflow rather than emptiness. They can sit with others' pain without trying to fix it because they're comfortable with pain as part of the human experience. They can offer wisdom without attachment to whether it's received because their sense of worth doesn't depend on being helpful. They can love deeply without losing themselves because they've discovered that their center remains intact regardless of external circumstances. This transformation from unconscious empath to sovereign healer represents what Jung considered the highest achievement of psychological development, but he emphasized that it's available to anyone willing to do the work. The work isn't easy. It requires facing truths that shatter your worldview. It demands you acknowledge your own complicity in patterns that harmed you. It asks you to grieve relationships with people who are still living but cannot meet you in consciousness. It necessitates feeling the full weight of emotions you've been avoiding for years or decades. It insists you develop a relationship with solitude because becoming yourself requires time away from others' expectations. It compels you to disappoint people who benefited from your unconsciousness. It forces you to tolerate being misunderstood by those who preferred the version of you that served their needs. But Jung argued that the alternative to this difficult work is remaining trapped in provisional life, forever waiting for permission to be yourself, endlessly seeking validation that never quite satisfies, perpetually giving away your power and wondering why you feel so depleted. The pain of staying unconscious might be more familiar than the pain of awakening, but familiarity shouldn't be confused with safety. The unconscious empath remains vulnerable to every manipulator they encounter. The awakened empath becomes functionally immune because they've learned to trust themselves more than they trust others' performances. This doesn't mean they become cynical or closed. It means they become wise, capable of discerning who deserves the gift of their sensitive nature and who would only exploit it. Jung spent his lifetime studying the process of psychological transformation, and he observed that certain elements consistently appeared in successful individuation journeys. First, there must be what he termed a breaking point, a moment when the pain of remaining unconscious exceeds the fear of becoming conscious. For empaths, this often comes after a particularly egregious betrayal, a physical or mental health crisis precipitated by years of self-abandonment, or simply reaching an age where they realize that continuing on their current path means living their entire life for others without ever discovering who they actually are. The specific catalyst matters less than the willingness to use it as an invitation to transformation rather than just another trauma to survive. Second, there must be a commitment to truth over comfort. Jung emphasized that psychological growth requires ruthless honesty with yourself about your patterns, motivations, and the ways you've been unconsciously participating in your own suffering. This honesty feels brutal because it strips away the comforting stories we tell ourselves to avoid taking responsibility for our choices. The empath must confront the truth that they've often chosen familiar dysfunction over unfamiliar health, that they've sometimes used their sensitivity as an excuse for avoiding difficult growth, that they've participated in their own objectification by relating to others primarily through usefulness. These truths hurt, but Jung insisted that temporary discomfort in service of permanent growth represents a worthy trade. Third, there must be what Jung called shadow integration, the conscious acknowledgement and acceptance of qualities that have been repressed or disowned. For empaths, this typically includes anger, selfishness, capacity for coldness, ability to cut people off, willingness to disappoint others, and comfort with being misunderstood. These qualities feel dangerous because empaths have been conditioned to believe that expressing them will result in abandonment or harm. The integration process involves testing this belief through small experiments, discovering that asserting boundaries or expressing anger doesn't actually cause the catastrophic outcomes that were predicted, and gradually building comfort with the full range of human emotion and response. Fourth, there must be a development of what Jung termed the observing ego, the part of consciousness that can witness your own patterns without judgment or immediate reactivity. This observing capacity creates space between stimulus and response, allowing the awakened empath to notice when they're being triggered into old patterns before they've already acted on them. With practice, this space expands, providing more time to choose conscious responses rather than unconscious reactions. The empath who once automatically absorbed others' emotions begins noticing when this absorption is happening and can choose whether to allow it or maintain their boundaries. This represents a fundamental shift from being lived by unconscious patterns to consciously directing your own psychological life. Fifth, there must be a tolerance for others' discomfort with your transformation. Jung observed that growth always disturbs the systems we're embedded in because those systems organize themselves around our previous patterns. When you change, everyone who related to the old version must adapt or leave. Many will resist your growth, attempting to pull you back into familiar roles through guilt, manipulation, or accusations that you've become someone they don't recognize. The awakened empath must develop what Jung called psychological autonomy, the capacity to remain centered in their own truth regardless of others' responses. This doesn't mean being uncaring about how your growth impacts others. It means recognizing that you cannot sacrifice your wholeness to maintain others' comfort, and anyone genuinely invested in your well-being would never ask you to. Finally, there must be what Jung termed the development of the symbolic life, a connection to meaning that transcends individual ego concerns. The awakened empath discovers that their transformation serves purposes beyond personal healing. They become examples for others still suffering, demonstrate that change is possible, and contribute to the evolution of relationship paradigms that have been dysfunctional for generations. This sense of participating in something larger than themselves provides resilience during difficult phases of growth because the work stops being solely about individual comfort and becomes about collective evolution. The awakened empath recognizes that every boundary they establish, every projection they refuse to accept, every manipulation they see through contributes to dismantling systems of unconscious exploitation that harm everyone, including the exploiters who remain trapped in their own unconsciousness. As we reach the culmination of this exploration into empathic awakening, we must confront Jung's most radical insight. The supposedly weak, overly sensitive, too emotional empath possesses within themselves the capacity to become psychologically antifragile, someone who grows stronger through challenge rather than being broken by it. This transformation from fragility to antifragility occurs not through developing a thicker skin or learning to care less, but through the paradoxical process of feeling more deeply while attaching less desperately. The awakened empath still feels everything, but they're no longer destroyed by what they feel because they've developed an unshakable sense of self that remains intact regardless of external emotional weather. Your sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was being taught that your sensitivity should be deployed in service of others while ignoring signals about your own needs and boundaries. Your deep feeling was never too much. The problem was being surrounded by people who had numbed themselves so thoroughly that your emotional authenticity felt threatening to their carefully constructed defenses. Your desire for authentic connection was never naive. The problem was being raised in systems where authentic connection was so rare that dysfunction seemed normal and healthy relating seemed unrealistic. Jung understood that the so-called pathology of the empath is actually the health response of a sensitive nervous system to unhealthy environments. The problem was never you. The problem was context that demanded you betray yourself to belong. The fed-up empath who emerges from the alchemical fire of transformation carries within themselves a quality that Jung termed numinous, a sense of spiritual gravity that others perceive even if they can't articulate what they're sensing. This quality emerges from having descended into your own darkness and emerging not broken but refined. People sense that you've been somewhere they fear to go and survived. They recognize that you possess knowledge that can only be earned through suffering that's been consciously metabolized rather than unconsciously repeated. They perceive that you can hold space for their full humanity, including their shadow, because you've learned to hold space for your own. This numinous quality makes you simultaneously attractive to those seeking genuine growth and repellent to those committed to unconsciousness. As Jung emphasized in his later works, the goal of psychological development isn't to become impervious to harm, but to become authentically yourself while remaining meaningfully engaged with life. The awakened empath achieves this by learning to protect their sensitivity without hardening it, to set boundaries without closing their heart, to discern without becoming cynical, to love without losing themselves. They become dangerous not through developing capacity to harm, but through becoming impossible to manipulate. And in a world built on unconscious exploitation, someone who cannot be manipulated represents a genuine threat to dysfunctional systems. Your awakening challenges everyone around you to examine whether they're relating to you as a full human being or as a function they need you to perform. Many will fail this examination. Your job is not to lower your standards to make them pass. Your job is to continue becoming more fully yourself and trusting that those meant to walk alongside you will rise to meet you there. The transformation is complete not when you stop feeling deeply, but when you stop abandoning yourself in response to others' inability to meet your depth. You remain a sensitive soul, but now that sensitivity serves wisdom rather than dysfunction. You remain capable of profound empathy, but now that empathy includes yourself. You remain open to connection, but now you're discerning about who receives access to your inner world. You've become what Jung envisioned as the individuated human, whole, conscious, and sovereign. And that, more than any weapon or strategy, is what makes you genuinely dangerous to those whose power depends on your unconsciousness. The empath has awakened, and nothing will ever be the same.